a brief word from a partner podcast.
This is Danielle Dardashti, host of The Nightingale of Iran, a riveting documentary podcast I made with my sister Galit. Our Jewish grandfather was a radio star in Iran, adored by Muslims. It was a mystery to us why he left during that golden age. We uncovered painful secrets, unspoken for generations. The Nightingale of Iran on all podcast platforms.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 450, High Holidays in a Kayak. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're continuing our series of episodes getting ready for the upcoming high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Over the last couple of weeks, we've spoken with Tzvika Krieger and with Jericho Vincent about their visions for the future of the high holidays. And through our Elul bonus episodes, Lex and Wendy Bernstein-Lash have been exploring what this particular new year can mean as we enter the third year of Judaism's 7-year sabbatical cycle. And this week, we welcome back Keshira haLev Fife, friend of Judaism Unbound, colleague, and teacher of Unbound Judaism, including in the Yeshiva, to build on these conversations as we close in on the new year in just a few days. In addition to being an incredible teacher, Keshira haLev Fife is a Kohenet, a Hebrew priestess, who leads a community called Keshira Pittsburgh in, you guessed it, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and today you'll learn about some of the innovative ways this community will be observing Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Before we dive in, a quick Yeshiva announcement. Earlier this week, we launched registration for our 8-week Fall 2024 Yeshiva classes. Our teachers this time around couldn't be better. They include Lainey Solomon, Juan Mejia, Sarah Imhoff, and Alicia Jo Rabins. We couldn't be more excited to make their ideas and wisdom available to you in our Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. So just head over to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more about each of these classes and to register. Financial aid is available to anyone who needs it and can be accessed from the registration pages for each of the 4 courses. So now let's dive into our conversation with Keshira haLev Fife. Keshira haLev Fife is a community weaver who reclaims ancient practices in ways that are resonant and relevant in the modern day. Keshira haLev Fife is the founding Kohenet of Keshira Pittsburgh and also the program director of Beloved and core faculty member at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. They are a very hard worker because they also work with Kirva, the Avodah Institute for Social Change, the Jewish Studio Project, and the Jewish Learning Collaborative. Keshira haLev Fife is also the former Oreget Kehila, that's executive director, of Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute, and you can learn more about that work on episode 246 of Judaism Unbound, which was entitled Priestessing Priestesses. And they were one of our first ever teachers in the Yeshiva, which you can hear about on episode 313, Learning, Unlearning, and Onion Learning. In addition to being ordained as a Kohenet, Keshira haLev Fife holds a BS in Social History and an MS in Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon University. So let's dive in. Keshira haLev Fife, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you on again.
Thank you. So good to be here.
I wanted to start by asking you, who's, a longtime friend, longtime listener of the show, if you put all the Jewish practices that there are in a bag and said you could only pick out 10 of them and live your Jewish life with those 10, would the high holidays be on your list? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
What a great question. Well, what came to me is that Teshuva would be in the bag. I'm not sure if it qualifies as a thing. It doesn't have any specific ritual item accompaniment, although you could argue the shofar. But Teshuva is really about returning at its root. We've come to assume all these other translations for it, which are not actually accurate. But if we think about Teshuva at its fundament as a return, what a blessing it is to have a beset time of year to return. For me, Teshuva is multifold. Part of it's about returning to myself, mostly about returning to myself, so that I can return to my loved ones, to my community, and also return to divine connection. I was teaching last week I offered that only by returning to oneself could we return to divine connection, and only by returning to divine connection could we truly return to self, that maybe they're interchangeable.
So can you go deeper into that, I guess, in the sense of what is it that people really are needing in their lives? When you say that you would choose returning, by the way, just a note, tshuva is that word that often is translated as repentance or atonement, but you're bringing us to this idea that it should be understood as returning, which is the more literal translation. What is it that people kind of are not doing on an ongoing basis that you need this time of year to come about once a year that says, hey, you should do this returning thing?
I will also just note to our listeners, Keshira didn't give a yes to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur being in the bag. And so I want to highlight that that's a little radical maybe, and also allow you, Keshira, to name that directly if it's the case, or whether you would distinguish between Teshuva generally and how it looks in these holidays.
I would say many of our ritual technologies and ritual items are much more accessible and meaningful, even at a superficial level. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they need some massaging, some work to get in there and find the marrow. And so for me, the headline is really about Teshuva. And maybe one of the reasons I'm not associating it directly and naming Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur as being list-worthy is that the Kabbalists also gave us Yom Kippur Katan. They said each month before the new moon, take the time to reflect and return. And to answer your question, I think the reason that I chose it, and I think what people need, whether they are explicit about it or not, is the invitation to slow down, to reflect, and to notice, is there a gap? What would it mean to be living the life that I truly want to be living? And is that the life I'm living? I'm not a scientist, but I know that if something's off by even a degree, or maybe this is math, and you go far enough into the future, you actually create a large distance rather than being on a direct trajectory.
For folks who can't see, Lex is currently salivating. He loves this analogy so much.
I love math analogies. It's where I always live.
Wonderful. So in this time of year, we have the opportunity to pause. If we think about returning to the origin point, then we get to redirect and say, okay, last year, I was slightly off base. I was distracted, or I was in grief, or I was lured away, or I wasn't paying attention, or I missed the mark. Whatever it is, we have the opportunity to come back to ourselves, to reorient, to check in with the internal compass, and set our direction for the next year, which effectively means if we do that every year or every month, we never get too far from our intended trajectory. We can make a reasonably sized course correction rather than reaching the end of life and realizing that we squandered it.
Okay, so now I'll say why I really like what you just said. I mean, I will be the first to admit, we live in this universe where the way people in my circles translate Teshuva tends more towards return. And I actually think that for a lot of people, that's not very clear. Like, what that means is not obvious. Return in English has a lot of different meanings, from like the button you press on the keyboard, or I guess now it says enter, but people think of it also as return sometimes. Like to start a new line, right? Like, we forget that it is return. We actually don't hear it as two separate things. We hear, or at least I don't want to speak for everybody. Like, I hear that as like one unit, and the turn part is not a big part of it. Like, return is just like, okay, I'm returning. I forget that turn is even there. But what you just said is what I think in Hebrew the return translation is kind of getting at. It's reorient. Like you used the phrase of orientation, and you talked about like vectors in math, or like a 1 degree difference in how you're angled. If you go out a long distance, or in this case, an entire year, in a direction that is not what you intended, you will end up not where you meant to. And if we think of our lives as like we start at 0, 0 on the XY axis or whatever, and we have some goal out in the distance, right? And so every once in a while, we need to actually like shift our vector, our body, our kavanah, our intention. Kavanah being like a word for direction, literally, like kivun in Hebrew. When we talk about intention for a prayer, kavanah, it's actually like, what direction do we want to be facing?
Exactly.
That's kind of the root. And so I like the way you just described it. That gives us a sense of, teshuva, return. It's like literally I'm turning my body, like I am embodying the act of like looking out into the distance, identifying where I want to be in that distance, because there's a whole horizon and there's a lot of different possibilities. And then I'm saying, in order for me to get there, my body, my soul, my essence, whatever, need to be faced in that direction. And I need to articulate, maybe out loud, but at least in internal language, how to get there. And I do think that's actually what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur aspire to do. Now, I don't think that most of our liturgy actually does a very good job of that. And that's kind of where my question is. I'm curious, like, to what extent do you use the tools in the toolbox of our traditional Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy to help people do that returning act? And to what extent do you go outside of that traditional toolbox and bring in other ways of helping us achieve that goal?
It's a little bit of both, because I agree with you that we want to orient body, spirit, soul, kavanah, intention toward where we want to go. And we also need to take accordant action. And so we need to commit to taking action in that direction, to putting resource in that direction, time, attention, energy in that direction. And of course, what has to precede that is identifying the direction. I also maybe didn't choose to name Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur as going in the bag because I'm not exactly sure what we mean when we say those holidays as a way to get there. Because for some people, sitting in a congregation in rows, hearing tunes that are nostalgic is a path to getting there. But for many people, it's not. For some people, taking a hike and reattuning themselves, slowing down and just becoming aware of themselves, reflecting on the past year is the route. For some people, chanting is the route. For some people, art making. I'm a proponent of inviting people to choose the path that works for them. And I want to encourage people to choose a path. I'm not prescriptive about which path it be. And I believe that the gift of Jewish time invites all of us at a beset time to go on that journey.
So that's really powerful. I almost want to invite people to like rewind, return, and like listen to it again. I'm going to like risk shifting us out of big mind into small mind, but I think it will end up being good. I want to talk just like tachlis, practically what your own approach through Kesher Pittsburgh to high holidays looks like, because it's both intertwined, overlapped with classic kinds of high holiday experiences. I mean, we spoke to Jericho Vincent recently and what they do with their community. I think people could look at that and be like, I don't know if that's a Rosh Hashanah service. I think Jericho would be like, yeah, it might be, it's like a different Rosh Hashanah thing. And that's what's awesome about it. I think people would look at Kesher Pittsburgh's high holiday float and be like, that is like orthogonal to a classic high holiday experience. And there's like kayaking involved. And on Yom Kippur, there's workshops and learning over the course of the day when much of the world is going to be doing what you just described, sitting in rows, having, prayer experience in some form. So can you talk to us a little about your community's high holidays? Cards on the table, I will be there, so I am excited about it. And to the degree to which you have made really conscious choices about like what we do in a classical kind of way, what we shift, I'd love to hear about that.
Sure. I'm also excited that you'll be with us for Yom Kippur this year. Our services have a multifold intention. Part of the intention is to create space for people to come together as a community in song. And we were doing this before the pandemic, but I will say that after the time when we could only do services on Zoom, it has become even more important to come together and hear people singing, or to feel people singing, to feel the resonance of when we sing together. Our Rosh Hashanah services effectively follow the blueprint of Shacharit plus Torah service. You could mistake it as a bar mitzvah, in fact, except that at the end we've got a shofar blast. We have a small section where we bless the shofar. And I think one of the things that's markedly different from what I grew up with, having been raised in a conservative synagogue, is that we curate what's happening. So in between things, not every single thing, but in between sections or particular prayers, a kavanah is offered by way of explaining, what is this thing? Why are we doing it? What could it mean? Where might I direct my attention while this thing is happening? So rather than just going through the prayers from the beginning, Modeh Ani, I am grateful, coming into Asher Yatzar, giving thanks that our bodies are working, we stop, we pause, and we invite people to consider, What is your body doing that you're not even having to give any thought to? And how often do you pause in gratitude for the workings of your body? And it may well be that your body is not working, quote unquote, perfectly, or that this year this is a hard prayer because you're noticing that in the aging process, you're not able to do some of the things that you used to be able to do. And at least for this moment, you could feel that and be thankful that you are in working order enough that you're here. And then we offer the prayer. I don't remember as a kid anybody pausing during services to say, this prayer that we're about to do, this is what it's about. It was kind of more of a flow. There was an expectation that you either knew what was happening or you didn't know what was happening. And I don't remember being particularly engaged for the hours and hours and hours that I was there. I was not allowed to bring reading material when I was a kid. The only activity that I did was to braid my dad's tallis fringes while I was sitting there. Then as an adult, when I moved overseas, I learned about this custom of bringing some reading material, and I started to put that inside my siddur. And then at some point I asked the question, what could be going on at a Rosh Hashanah service that would mean that I could forego my reading material, that I actually wanted to be present in what was happening? In the same way, as some folks feel the nostalgia of the Nusach, the traditional melodies of the high holidays from the 80s, 90s, whenever I was going as a kid, some of our nostalgic tunes come from summer camp. And some of them are tunes that we've integrated into our own Shabbat services. We have a few traditions that we've embedded that involve people in the community having a role in the service. And so it's intended to be more participatory, as though we're all doing this together. And of course, there are people at the front who are leading the way, but it's not a spectator. It's not a performance. People are not intended to come and sit in rows. So that's a little bit about our Rosh Hashanah service. And then, of course, there is the tradition and custom of Tashlich. We have iterated over the years exactly how we do Tashlich. It used to be that we did it right after Rosh Hashanah services, and then we found out that it was just too long of a day for many people. And so we separated it, and we now have our Tashlich ritual on the Sunday between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It coincides with Sunday school so that all the kids, families can also be part of it. And it started in the time of COVID, because we were trying to figure out how can we do something outdoors where people are distant and not just lined up in great length along the river. We wanted them to be able to hear when we were leading the prayers or singing songs together. And we thought kayaking seemed like a good option because people are kind of in clumps on the water, but not too close to one another. And it's engaging and interesting, and it allows people to really bring their bodies into what's happening. We wanted to make it a more meaningful and engaged activity. So we changed it up a little bit. We used to have birdseed, but these days we don't even do that. We have rice paper, and people are invited to come and to write on the rice paper, what is it that they're releasing to the water? And we do a short teaching on the reclamation of indigenous naming of the Walakane River, also known as the Allegheny River. And we talk about the people who lived there before and what the water meant for them. We talk about what the water connects to. I think particularly for young minds, making the connection that the water that we're next to connects to the ocean, connects to all the waters, is made of the same water that's been around since time immemorial. And then people go out in kayaks. We send them with a piece of paper that has a reading on it that helps them set their intention. And they release their rice paper, which is dissolvable, so it's gone before they get back to the shore. No harm to the water. And then we also offer on that morning, there's some snacky brunch food, and we usually have an embodied movement teacher that's there to help us to stretch and to align. And it's also an opportunity for people to be social and to talk about how Rosh Hashanah was and to think about how Yom Kippur might be, and is another building block in returning to one another. It's become an expectation of our community. I think we've been doing this 4 or 5 years. I used to get teary talking about this because I imagine a time in the future when kids will ask, why do we kayak on Tashlich? And someone will say, it came about in the time of my grandparents when there was a COVID plague and we had to be outside and do things differently. It reminds me that something that we do as a matter of course or as a way to just account for circumstances can easily become a tradition. We have to be careful about what we create and thoughtful about what we create. And in this case, I'm really glad that we were.
So when you think about making various changes or innovations, and we're going to get to more of the innovations later in our conversation, but Just before we started recording, you mentioned that two things that your community does sort of the way that you might expect are the Kol Nidre on the eve of Yom Kippur and Avinu Malkeinu, which is a prayer that we actually talked about with Tzvika Krieger a few weeks ago. And I really want to start on that one. I know Lex is a big maven of Kol Nidre, so I'll leave that one to him. But Avinu Malkeinu is like, you couldn't imagine a more old school prayer. You know, it talks about our Father, our King, and in a community that is so feminist, you know, that is led by a Kohenet, a priestess, it surprised me. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about why that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Avinu Malkeinu, the tune, has a resonance for many of us that evokes something. I don't assume what the something is, but it kind of perks people up when they hear the tune. And so what we've done firstly is that the translation that we use reads, "Our loving parent." That is the address in Avinu Malkeinu. We sing just the very beginning, and then we shift into an English, it's not a translation, an English rendition, I'll say, to the tune of Avinu Malkeinu that was written by Kohenet Riv Shapiro. And the words are, "Slow down, child, slow down." But it's become a hallmark of the high holidays because it really is a time, just for those 3 or 4 minutes, the reminder, slow down, child, slow down, is maybe an invitation to come back to the self. And the part of Avinu Malkeinu, which traditionally we would sing Aseh Imanu Tzedakah V'Chesed, instead here we say, "A river flows from within you to where you will go. The current carries you home. Let your life unfold," which I think comes as such a welcome relief to people, to have people around them, to hear those words, to take them in. How would my year be different if I let the current of the river carry me home? Which is not to say do nothing, hop on a raft and float through your life, but maybe to rebalance how much we struggle and effort and work to remember that there are forces greater than us that are also holding us while we do.
Can you talk a little bit specifically, as we're just talking about this one prayer as an example? I'm thinking about 3 elements, and I'm thinking a little bit about this playlist that I put together years ago that was a bunch of kind of pop songs that I very intentionally put in a certain order and tried to get the theme of the holiday in a kind of experiential way, but it didn't explicitly say which prayer anything was meant to be a take on. And I'm sure the vast majority of people missed that. And that's fine. That was not, my intent wasn't that everybody should be thinking, which prayer is this? And it was a theory that said, hey, we're trying to accomplish a certain experience, a certain spiritual experience on this day, and it can be accomplished through different ways. And let's see if we can accomplish it through a completely different set of prayers, one might say, in the form of songs. Now, some of them were Leonard Cohen songs that were explicitly modeled on the holidays, the High Holiday Liturgy, but a lot of them weren't. So I'm thinking about one thing that you could do is something like that, is just say, hey, let's take seriously that this particular prayer, Avinu Malkeinu, is meant to accomplish a particular thing for people. Maybe that language is alienating now and it's not even accomplishing that. Let's have this other wonderful song that you're talking about, and let's just do that and not even mention Avinu Malkeinu. Then there's another possibility that says, let's either do Avinu Malkeinu or do a little bit of it like you're talking about. Why? Maybe because people expected or people wanted, there's nostalgia, there's other things, and love for you to go into more reasons for that. And the third is some version where we say, this like everything is a metaphor. So it actually never meant a father and a king up in the sky. And somehow people have forgotten or lost the muscle of metaphor. And so I guess I would ask you there is there still something that a notion of our father, our king, could be a metaphor for that's still sort of valuable or relevant?
I'm not sure exactly what word to say first. I want to say yes and maybe at the same time. What's coming to me is that Avinu Malkeinu at a time was part of a group of people trying to make sense of the world and why it was the way that it was and what their role was in improving it. We're not different than those people. We just live in a different time and in a different set of circumstances with a different understanding of the workings of the world. And ever since I've been leading and making Jewish community, I've kind of held what is ancient that is still meaningful and sensible, and what is present moment resonant that awakens something in us, and what is at the intersection of those two things. So sometimes I dispense with something liturgical entirely and replace it with something else. And other times it's a little bit of a blend or a mashup. I love a good mashup because it evokes something old. Even if the something old is, why are we saying these words of Avinu Malkeinu? This doesn't really make sense anymore. It's connecting us across time to when there was a different understanding of what it meant to be Jewish and what it meant to be alive. And I imagine that in times to come, someone might come back to an archive and pick up the Machzor, the prayer book of Keshira Pittsburgh, and say, wow, at that time, they thought whatever it is that we seem to be purporting in our Machzor, and that the evolution of spiritual practice, of thought, of understanding, of being, might locate us closer to Avinu Malkeinu. I hope that that doesn't happen, but I have no illusion about the fact that the world is constantly changing and that so are we. The second piece is that for me, the practice of being in holiday, quote unquote, services is not a purely cerebral thing. So the sense making, the translation, the objection to text is one level of the exercise. Another level is the feelings that are brought forward by the music, by the rhythm, by the sound of the Hebrew. And to invite, it's like opening a door and saying to someone, if this is meaningful, if this draws you in, come on in. If not, hang on a minute or two. It'll be a different tune, a different language, a different something else, a different format. Maybe that will be the thing that draws you in. And our goal ultimately is to make space for everyone to come in, recognizing they're not all going to come in the same door, and that's okay.
You've used the word machzor a couple times, and I want to shout out that word also in Hebrew ties to a differently connoted word for return, which I don't think we talk about. If you ask people, what does machzor mean? They will usually respond, the book you use on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but that's not its meaning. It's become a meaning. Its meaning is from the root chet zayin resh, which is another word for return. And so I don't know, like, it's worth noting that we have all these differently inflected ways of talking about, like, reorienting, revisiting, returning. It's a time of year, which makes sense because we are naming this as a pivotal kind of new year where you're, like, both rewinding and thinking backwards and also looking forward. And that is what I wanted to go to, is the looking backward, looking forward piece, because I want to sit with kayaking more. First off, I hope that the kayaking ritual spreads to many communities, and in 100 years or 500 years, people are still kayaking, A, because that will mean that climate change has not destroyed human inhabitation of the world, but B, because it would be cool if 100 years from now or 500 years from now, people are still kayaking. If they are, I do not think it will be the case that if you ask them where this ritual came from, they will reply, there was this thing, COVID, there was a pandemic, and people make this choice to practically, like, do something outdoors, distant, like, because most Jewish rituals have an answer like that in terms of how they started, like a practical reason, connection to a local custom or to a differently religious community or to a time period. But then what happens is we come up with mythologized, and I don't mean fake, but we come up with mythologized reasons. And when I saw that you kayak, I genuinely assumed, like, this might just be how my brain works and that I'm a weirdo, but, like, I assumed that part of why you kayaked is that, yes, you're on the water. Yes, it's a way to do tashlich in, like, an embodied way in many senses. But I was like, oh, kayaking is an action that actually parallels the framework of what we're doing on high holidays. You, like, push backwards in order to propel your kayak forwards. That's actually what Teshuva is. You're like looking inward, you're reflecting, all of those words, looking inward, reflecting, like introspection. They all are about considering ways we have been so far, past tense, and trying to mobilize those have-beens into will-be's that are
beautiful.
different, maybe. So, by the way, sometimes we might look back and say we've been doing great in certain ways, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur can equally be, I want to make sure to retain that. Like, I think we actually miss that sometimes. But kayaking is an action that actually does that in a physical, true, like scientific way. And the other cutesy thing I said to you before we started this is that the word kayak, K-A-Y-A-K, is the same backwards and forwards. I think, so I don't know if people will use the English alphabet. I don't know that kayak will be spelled the same in 500 years if this ritual stays. But like, I believe that if we had any kind of explanation for it in a century or multiple, it would be something like that, which I'm saying not to like push back on you, but to say that we mythologize. And I actually think that that's great and good. And it's actually a push. It's an invitation for us to do the rituals that call to us and trust that even if they are for a practical purpose, even if they are for some like logistical reason initially, or just because we want to, Jewish history will unfold and we'll come up with the beautiful drash, the beautiful take that is why this is sort of transhistorically across all eras a beautiful thing to do.
May it be so. I'm thinking about the fact that the first year people came to services and stayed for kayaking. And the second year, we noticed there were some registrations just for the kayaking. People weren't coming to the service. And I thought, interesting. And on further reflection, realized how wonderful it is that there are multiple options of ways to engage. I want to pick up on one thing that you said, Lex, which is that, sometimes on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we reflect and realize things are going okay. Last year, when we did a ritual of giving back to the water, not the Tashlich ritual, but we went down to the river during the Yom Kippur service and asked people to call out what are the things that they're releasing to the water. And then as it was happening, I realized it's not right to just dump all this stuff in the water and then make our way back. So we asked people, what could we bless the water with? What went well last year? And to hear 150 people calling out everything from I made a new friend to I learned a new skill, and to uplift all the ways in which we're doing great is also a meaningful part of the holiday. I think one of the reasons that there's a resistance to it is like, this is the time where I have to go and feel bad about myself, is kind of a subtitle of the high holidays. The first year, I had someone in my community say to me, my husband is not into this, but he's going to come, he's going to try it. I said, okay. So a week or so after, I said to her, how did it go for him? And she said, they got back in the car after, and she said, what did you think? And he said, I really enjoyed it, and I felt like I shouldn't have. That makes all the sense in the world and is heartbreaking. There's enough in the world that we don't enjoy and that makes us feel bad about ourselves and the state of the world. To be able to come together to celebrate our Jewishness, to celebrate new beginnings, to celebrate the opportunity and the capacity to be aware and to return, to do better, to build better, everything that is tied up in the deep meaning of the high holidays. I want to put that at the forefront. And yes, of course, there has to be time for reflection and teshuva, but I don't think anyone comes to Keshira Pittsburgh to beat their chest. We gently rub the chest, tap the chest to open our hearts more, not to be harder on ourselves.
I'm thinking about the water and how relieved it must feel to not only have all these bad things be put in it. I mean, can you imagine, like, from the water's perspective, Tashlich, we all kind of enjoy it, but from the water, they're like, oh no, again? They're going to be flooding me with all this negativity. And in all seriousness, it feels like there's something powerful there about the way we have used and abused the natural world.
Yeah, and as an aside, I think we need to say, like, a lot of traditional tashlichs actually in their own doing harm the natural world because they use bread that, like, kills or at least severely injures fish, which when I learned that, I was like, why are we still doing that? It's supposed to be getting rid of this.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that for a long time people didn't realize that, and they didn't know that it was causing harm. But that's true, I think, of the whole way that we've hurt the natural world. For a long time, like at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or I don't know, it seems like you'd probably realize that the black smoke going up isn't doing great things. But there wasn't an understanding that human beings had the power to harm the natural world. Actually, I think that's a really significant point with regard to the high holidays, in the sense that they come, all of religion, all of human thoughts and philosophy in general come from an understanding of the world where human beings were at the mercy of the natural world, so much so that they understood the natural world to be gods. And the notion that I could do anything that was going to cause some kind of lasting damage to the earth or to the world was unthinkable. And so the change of our time, I think one of the most significant changes of our time, is now we do recognize, not everybody, but most of us do recognize that human beings have the capacity to harm the world, and actually we are harming the world. And in that sense, I think it behooves us to think about ourselves not as gods, but when we think about how we have always been praying to God and asking God to do various things, because there's an understanding that when somebody has the power to cause harm, then we should ask them to do not harm, that we maybe ought to turn some of that prayer onto ourselves, saying, like, I pray that I will stop doing this. But I just want to go back to Tashlich for a second, because what I'm wondering about, and maybe this is just the same point, what I'm wondering about is if we started to understand or rethink the Jewish holiday cycle more broadly, but starting with the high holidays as one where it actually started, and actually a folk tradition, Tashlich, that we really love, started and was causing damage to the world, to the earth, to the water, to the animals in ways that we didn't even understand for a long time. There's a certain tshuva to do there, a certain return, a certain repentance. And what would it look like to have that be a turning for all of our religious life, to be more about how, at least we incorporate as a major part of it, how we're going to have a different relationship with the natural world?
Beautiful. There's an organization, I don't know what they are called, but they have a reverse tashlich. It's on a beset day, and groups of people go out and clean up waterways. I want to pick up on something that you just said, Dan. You were describing this idea, we're praying to a God, we're asking for things. And I want to just quibble with it a little bit, because I think the conception of God as separate from us and or as granting us things that we ask for maybe is not a given. And it made me think about Unatana Tokef and the idea that prayer, tzedakah, translated as justice, and teshuva, translated as return, are a way to, quote unquote, transform the harshness of the decree, or avert the decree. I prefer transform. And as a child, my understanding was that if I got real fervent between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I asked my parents to make a donation to somewhere, and I really thought hard about all the things I didn't do so well in the last year, I could avoid something bad happening to me in the year ahead. And then over time, it didn't really add up, because bad things happen to good people. And I didn't believe that it was because they didn't do enough between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Somebody, and I wish I knew who this somebody was, teaches that what happens between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur pales in comparison to what happens between Yom Kippur and the next Rosh Hashanah. When I think about the fact that that's a much greater amount of time, and it's a time in which we can affect much more change in ourselves and in the outside world, it led me to thinking about the idea that through prayer, through relationship with my own yearning and relationship with divinity, through tzedakah, through being invested and committed to creating a more just world, and teshuvah, continually returning, I can't change what's going to happen in my life or in the world, but I can transform my relationship to it. I can change how I experience what's unfolding through these three methodologies of being in right relationship. Perhaps part of the return is returning to the awareness of just how much we are divinity unfolding.
I really am, similar to you, heartbroken but also unsurprised by the story you told with the participant in your programming who said that they enjoyed it and felt bad that they enjoyed it. I think that points to something really, really critical to how we understand these holidays. And I think it actually helps me unearth my deep discomfort with them. Because I think experientially, it's not that people say this at the front of the rooms, but I do think for some people, it doesn't feel like you're supposed to have a good time. You know, with Passover Seder, I think people go into it and they're like, yes, there are spiritually minded, justice minded messages here. And also, we're supposed to have a good time. We're doing a scavenger hunt in our house looking for matzah, giving symbolic meanings to foods. We're drinking a bunch of wine. Like it's clearly like there's a fun aspect here. With Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I genuinely think that it's not only that people go to services and see them as like, oh, they're failing to be fun. I actually think that folks have so internalized what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are that they think that they're not supposed to be fun. They think the job of the holiday is actually almost a kind of self-hazing. We are showing our commitment either to Judaism or God by doing something for a bunch of hours that is actually not enjoyable. So when it feels enjoyable, like your participant who came, there's actually a dissonance and you're like, wait, am I supposed to feel happy and good right now? And so I'm feeling called to bring up actually the word sacrifice, not just on these holidays, but they feel like even if they don't go to Jewish spaces that much, like in order to be committed in some way to Jewish experience, to Judaism, what's important is to show that like you're willing to deal with something not your favorite in order to be part of this people. Like you go on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, even though it's not super jazzy, because of that. It links to how when I talk about sacrifices in the Bible, folks are always surprised when I say some of them, it's just like a big meal with your friends. Like you're not, some of them are slaughtered and you're like giving up an animal and it goes up to God, right? Like that's what people think of. But some of them, like you're supposed to just like be around a table with some people and eat together. And that actually is a sacrifice. That's a korban. That's a form of connection to God. And I think the fact that people are surprised by that is actually parallel to your congregant or your attendees' experience. I'm kind of pining for you to give your pitch for why Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur should be fun. Like, I actually think we have to make the case that these days are not supposed to be unfun. But I think a lot of people are operating in a heart and head space where they're like, I put on a suit and tie, partially because it's not even my favorite thing to wear, but I'm like putting on uncomfortable clothes because part of these days is to like sacrifice of myself, not primarily be thinking about meaning making for myself.
I think the first thing to say is that the opposite of unfun doesn't have to be fun. There are elements certainly of fun and joy. I think what we're angling more towards is meaningful. How things start is how things are. And that alone is a kavanah for how to bring ourselves to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. How we begin the year, the intention that we set puts us on the vector of how things can unfold. And so we're thoughtful about what's the vibe that we're creating. All apparel is welcome. If a suit and tie is how you want to welcome the new year, by all means. Most people come in festive, comfortable clothing. Half of them are sitting on camping chairs. So they're wearing what you wear when you're sitting on a camping chair. We're outside for most of our services. Part of that has to do with being in our bodies and being fully there. I can remember sitting in synagogue as a kid, looking at the watch to figure out how much longer did I need to be wearing tights. I don't think anybody's wearing tights, especially if they're going kayaking. But to really bring themselves with an openness that they might have feelings. And some of the feelings will be peak joy and fun, hopefully. And some of the feelings will be tearful. There's a lot to reflect on, especially in this past year. We want to make space for however people are arriving. We don't expect everyone to come and have fun. We also don't preclude people coming and having fun. It also feels connected to what you were saying before, Lex, this idea that if it's fun, we've somehow done something wrong. I think it is connected to this internalized sense that we're abandoning the collective identity of the Jewish people if we do things in a different way. That idea which sometimes is used to strengthen us, we're all part of something, can also cause harm to us because it limits us. Sometimes it even limits us from healing. I am based in a place where the collective identity has been so informed by shared trauma that I'll just say that it may have slowed down our healing in some ways.
And just to be clear, what you're talking about is the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. I've thought a lot about the way that the collective awareness of the aftermath of the shooting in the Tree of Life building has impacted the Jewish community in Pittsburgh. And the October bookend, of course, is now October 7th. And the way that that has impacted our collective identity, our understanding of ourselves and of each other, and of what it means to be Jewish, will almost certainly should come to bear on the high holidays. And so then the question is, can we allow ourselves to do what we as humans do, which is feel more than one thing at a time, hold complexity and paradox? Lately, when people say, "How are you?" I've been saying the world feels hard, and I'm so glad and grateful to be alive and in it. Those things can coexist. And I think the same thing is true in the high holidays.
So we've talked about the high holidays in general. We've talked about Rosh Hashanah a lot. I think a lot of people's experience of the high holidays is like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is basically the same. Yom Kippur, you fast and maybe wear white, and not so clear, like from a services standpoint. I don't know that people could tell you that many distinctions between the services on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But my sense is that the experience at Keshira Pittsburgh is going to be quite different between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So can you talk a little bit about how they'll be different and why?
For a few years now, we've had services Rosh Hashanah morning and Yom Kippur morning. They've been different in that we read Torah on Rosh Hashanah and we actually don't read Torah on Yom Kippur. We do more embodied ritual, or have done more embodied ritual on Yom Kippur. And our Kol Nidre service is now an in the round, more like a chanting circle with a little bit of liturgy here and there, which is intended to soften and open the heart as we move into Yom Kippur. However, we decided this year to do things a little bit differently. And so on Yom Kippur, people will be invited to choose a path to Teshuva. And the paths to Teshuva will include things like going on a group hike or learning with wonderful teachers, including Lex Rofberg, who will be coming to join us. We have some others coming in as well. There will be a Jewish studio process, creative practice around Teshuva. There'll be activities for young children and for older children. There'll be some chanting and meditation, no doubt more that I'm forgetting. And I'll also be offering later in the day a listening circle around Israel-Palestine and what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, not intended for people to be in conversation or discussion, but for people to be able to share with witness, how are they feeling? What's arising for them? And to be in the embodied practice of listening to one another and staying. That's the whole practice, is to just say, Hineni, I'm here. I think about this as kind of a soul spa with a good slough and maybe some massaging where there are knots, and hope that people feel better, more aligned, more attuned to themselves and to each other when we come out of that. And then in the afternoon, we'll have a healing mincha service. There'll be an opportunity to join together with folks at the JCC. We have a High Holidays of Hope collaboration, which includes Yizkor, which is a service of remembrance for those who are remembering parents, other people who are close in our lives. And then we'll have the closing service, Havdalah, as the gates close. And we do also an embodied practice of intention setting. Every person gets to declare what are they moving into as they go through the gates and to physically move from one place to the other. And then we make Havdalah. And for those who are fasting, we break the fast. And I want to say explicitly, not everybody fasts. We are explicit in our community that we don't expect that people are fasting, that we are in solidarity with people who are in recovery from eating disorder, body dysmorphia, those whose physical constitutions require eating in order for them to be well, and that they are no less deep in the practice of Yom Kippur if that is one of their paths to Teshuvah. Sometimes making Teshuvah with the body is part and parcel of what it means to return.
Can you just say a few words about why your Yom Kippur is different from your Rosh Hashanah?
So in terms of why they're different, prayer services have been a way for a long time. And what I've come to realize is that more people are outside the synagogues on the high holidays than are inside. And so our Yom Kippur is intended to offer another path where folks can be in community together, returning, exploring, questioning, connecting, rather than having to figure it out on their own. We're going to learn this year. Some people might say, this is great, let's do it every year. And other people might say, you know what, we prefer the previous format, and then we'll have to consider. This year, we wanted to create an opportunity that was more interactive, because even though we conceive of ourselves as all being in prayer together, there is still a frontal element when there are folks at the front on the microphone and people who are sitting in chairs taking in what's being offered. We're hoping that this year allows people to engage in Teshuva in a new and different way.
For a future day, Dan, I'm sticky noting that we should really talk about the word fun. I find myself really defensive of the word fun because I think people in many of my own beloved Jewish communities have this big distinction between the word fun, quote unquote, and the word joy, quote unquote. And I think it links to my own deep passion for finding sacredness in that which is seen as mundane or profane. Like, we spend time on this show talking about finding Torah in reality TV or in sports fandom or in cartoons. I think there's a reason why we are made to feel uncomfortable with fun, but to see joy as a deep goal. The question I have, I love that you are creating a situation on Yom Kippur specifically where the day is not sort of services with kibitzing in between, which I think is how it often is, but rather the kibitz, and again, kibitzing I don't say to diminish it. I like things that feel low-key, similar to fun, but like the kibitzing, the learning, the conversation, the interaction, when I am in whatever communities I'm in, that are more classic in their way of doing Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. When I've been the leader, I've often said like, hey, y'all, I'm going to be here in between. And I actually personally, like I say this to the room, I have found for many years that my favorite and most impactful moments in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are often when I'm sitting with three people in the hour in between, or the couple hours in between the end of the morning service and the beginning of the afternoon service. And we're just like in the lobby talking about whatever we're talking about. You've made the kibbutz, you've made that part of the actual capital R ritual. And so I'd love to close out with like why it might be a worthwhile thing to take steps in different communities towards seeing not just the service, but learning, discussion, the in-between, quote unquote, as not just in between, but actually sort of what the purpose of the days is.
The high holidays are a complicated kind of high wire act because I feel the gravity of the meaning of the season, and I'm really committed to stripping pretense out of places. So we're explicit with people, come as you are, be comfortable. And in fact, we take a break on Rosh Hashanah morning between Shacharit, the morning service, and the Torah service. Of course, we're in Pittsburgh, so the kids have dubbed this halftime. So we have halftime with halftime snacks.
The halftime show at the Super Bowl is one of the most, you can't leave your television. You got to watch Usher.
Exactly. Well, we won't be having Usher. However, we have snacks and we invite people to mix and mingle. And it's like a reunion. Many people that we don't see throughout the year on a monthly basis when we gather for Kabbalat Shabbat come together to check in on each other, to reconnect, which is really beautiful. And I think that's part of what we're there to do. In a conception where returning happens in multi-dimensions, returning to each other is part of what we're doing. And that doesn't have to be a choreographed thing. The conversations in between are really valuable because the truth is that people want to be part of a community when they're connected to other people in the community. Another innovation, if we could call it that we've brought to Rosh Hashanah is that when we do our Torah chanting, we have the first two aliyot which come from Torah. Sometimes we chant them directly. Sometimes we offer a chant of a specific verse from the parsha that we're reading from. But in the last few years, we've added the third aliyah is in English. And I don't mean a translation of the Torah. I mean that I chant an English aliyah, which is the story of our community in this time. And people can understand directly what I'm saying, because I'm telling the story of us as gathered with what we're committed to and how we're building this community and what matters to us, which year on year doesn't change that much. It might have a little something that's taken out or added in. But part of the reason that we do that is to remind folks that the Torah, in addition to being a source of wisdom, is a story of our people, and that we're still part of the conversation. We're still part of the story. I love asking this question. If you were to write the parsha of your life, what would the story be about? And so we've incorporated this into our service, first in order to give people an aliyah that they can understand. Most people can't understand the Torah Hebrew that's being chanted, and to uplift and assert the story of ourselves at this time, and is integral to the story of the Jewish people.
Thank you so much, Keshira, haLev, Fife, for joining us. It's been such a pleasure.
Always good to be with you both. And Shana Tova, even if it's a little early.
And a Shana Tova to you as well, Keshira, and to all our listeners. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close, a reminder for the new year, we've got new on yeshiva classes. That seems like a logical thing to do, so we're doing it. You can head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more. We have 8-week courses that are launching registration now. They don't begin for a little bit. They begin in mid-late October, but you can sign up for classes with Juan Mejia, Alicia Jo Rabins, Sarah Imhoff, and Lainey Solomon. They are amazing teachers. Check out more, and we'll say a little bit more about the topics in future episodes, but you can check out the classes now yourself at judaismunbound.com/classes. We want to encourage you to be in touch with us with any questions you have, thoughts, ideas about high holidays, or anything else about the future of Judaism. You can be in touch in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, all sorts of other goodies. Third, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. And we are also really deeply appreciative if you're able to support us financially with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.